The Union of Federated States. Tarnished by a civil war and brutalized by the horrific technologies it unleashed to claim victory, the Union is a dark reflection of its former glory, the conquest and subjugation of former Confederacy and the deeper South, as well as the new opportunities opening in the West, stand as a grim consolation for the Union's war-wearied soul. The Union share the formidable military might their country now wields, to ensure that never again will anyone have to pay the brutal price that freedom demands. Nothing, however, can truly extinguish the fire of the American spirit. Scarred and brutalized by their own experiences, the Union's military-industrial complex is well aware of the depths to which man can fall. The only hope is to be found in having strength and resolution to stand tall in the face of a great adversity, whatever the cost. First draft of Rise of Our Nation by Committee on Public Information. Manifest Destiny, 2 words, that define the Union of Federated States, a rejection of the old order of the world and the foundation of the new nation, in the midst of a pristine land blessed with natural resources. The Union was founded as a beacon of freedom and equality in the world, a country where every man and woman would have a voice, where every person's rights would be sacrosanct, emerging from the War of Independence against a stagnant and oppressive Imperial British Crown. The Union of Federated States was born into the future, but could not be denied. Eye of a beholder, yet at the heart of the endeavour, at the very core of that great nation in infancy, fissures were already forming. The corners of the Union hid a dark shadow, where the voices of the dispossessed and disenfranchised and the excluded echoed in fear and anger, striving for their own hopes and dreams to be heard, to be acknowledged, and to be included in the great endeavour. Those voices went unheard, their demands went unnoticed, and so, even as the Union began to take its first few steps on the world stage at the end of the 18th century, suffused with its victory over the Crown, the Union was ready to accept its role as champion of liberty and freedom, to prove to all the nations of the earth that it was possible to be a free people, to work together, to create perfection, but the fault lines of division and failure were already there. Enemies without. For decades, the Union flourished, at least externally. Each of the former colonies in America had become a federated state, brimming with pride at their new standing and at the part that they had each played in defeating one of the greatest powers of the world to earn their freedom. A feverish energy swept the land, and the newest nation on earth began to press out in all directions, moving from the original Crown colonies into the surrounding countryside. But the Crown was not about to lose such a precious jewel so easily. There were constant skirmishes as the Crown pushed and prodded its wayward child in 1,000 petty ways. The dissatisfied and dispossessed within certain states were nurtured and goaded into all manner of treacheries. To the north, the Crown Dominion of Canada was incited to cause all sorts of problems, while around the world the fledgling navy of a new nation was harried at every turn. The newly born French Republic was so quick to support the Union in their war for independence, elected to remain outside the conflict. The Union would stand alone or fall. But whether it was driven back northern land grabs from the Dominion, the rising outlaw posses in the south and west of the country, or naval clashes with the Crown and the Union withstood it all. Even when Crown forces swept down from staging points in the Dominion and ransacked the capital, the Union could not be brought low. The bones of a new nation were strong and united. The will of people were indomitable. Enemies within. Despite this sense of invincibility, the fractures that grew deeper and deeper with each passing triumph could not be ignored forever. The Crown did all they could to give succor to the diverging ideology, separating the northern states from the southern. Grievances were many and were deeply felt on both sides. But it was not the Crown who eventually set brother and sisters against one another in the Union. For nearly a decade, the Union had tolerated the presence of a group from the Covenant of Enlightenment, a global coalition comprising of many of preeminent brilliant minds of the age. This cabal of the enlightened had ensconced themselves deep within the Western territories, hiding from the prying eyes of the world, while most of the enlightened arrogantly declared themselves to be the sole custodians of the fruits of their brilliance. The enlightened, led by Bursts and Carpavian, were a different philosophy. Unlike their peers elsewhere in the world, these egalitarian members of the Covenant believed that the marvels that they developed should be made freely available to all that could afford them. When the money could not be readily given, perhaps some other currency might be offered, such as land ties, mineral access, or information that might lead to further breakthroughs. Like their peers elsewhere in the world, these men and women could turn their genius to create the most destructive weaponry imaginable. All they needed was willing customers desperate enough to pay their price. It is impossible to know in hindsight if the war between the states would have occurred without the offer of support from Carpavian and his enlightened. It is possible that men of reason and peace living and ruling on either side of a great divide might have come to some accommodation. Many of the differences were fading even as the violence grew imminent. It was argued by several statesmen of the day that if given enough time, peace would have been possible. The Oil War. The initial flashpoint in 1816 was a dispute over the state of a central government should have control over the extensive oil and mineral reserves of Mississippi and Texas. Indeed, the Civil War was also known as the Oil War for that reason. Carpavian and the enlightened peers loyal to him knew that the wealth and power they required for their greater work would only be if they had these tensions and fears were stoked. Weapons of terrible efficiency and horrific power found their way to any faction who might conceivably triumph with coming conflict. Money, credit, contingencies, and future considerations were traded at feverish rate for juiced rifles, automata, sonic cannons, and the RJ-1027, the wonder fuel that allowed all these infernal devices to be powered. The Oil War escalated into all-out civil war, a conflict like the likes of which had never been seen by a man on earth before. Entire towns were turned to storms of ash, twisting on infernal breezes, roaring up into blackening skies. Armies were swept from the field as streams of crimson power flashed beneath the rising clouds of smoke and dust. In the first year alone, over 1 million souls were lost, civilians and soldiers together, as the nation went mad, tearing it at itself like a diseased animal without reason or sense. And that was only the beginning. Conflict on a new scale, brutal raids on towns and villages swept out from the dark, foreboding forests, cutting down farmers, merchants, and craftsmen and their families in acts of reprisal. The forest was set to the torch, and raiders screaming from their last agonized breaths in the fury of flames. The war spilled beyond the borders of the Union, and soon the Republic of Mexico became a battleground too. The Mexicans were drawn into the conflict to aid the Confederates in exchange for a promise of favorable terms after the conflict ended. Armored land ships crawled across the churned, muddy ground, shrugging off blasts that would have shattered castles. And then, as they fell upon the fortified enemy positions, they were turned into piles for their crews. Even more powerful weapons were brought to bear. And while the factories of the enlightened weighed and measured, making certain that the Confederacy and Union were evenly matched, so neither would have that decisive advantage, and equal currency and titles were pledged by both sides, should they be victorious. But the very balance, of course, only made conflict much more terrible.